All right.
All right. So to start off, I have a guest here. We're going to be talking about environmental climate change today. And would you like to introduce yourself really quickly?
Yeah, for sure. So my name is Adarsh Vinodkumar. I am a University of Arizona graduate, graduated back in 2023, and I'm currently applying to medical school. I have a lot of experience in the outdoors. Growing up, my family always liked to go hiking and camping, and we always loved visiting beaches and mountains. So I have a great appreciation for Mother Nature and everything that she brings us.
All right. So yeah, to just following up with that, what comes to mind when you think of climate change? And do you think that humans play a significant role in it?
So, first thing that comes to mind when I think climate change is like the rising sea levels, right?
Mm-hmm.
Polar ice caps melting, the whole shebang. It's honestly pretty awful when you think about it. But point is that post-industrial revolution, the amount of greenhouse gases that we as a species have been putting into the atmosphere have greatly increased the rate at which the climate is changing. And it's a rate at which Mother Nature can't quite keep up with. So I expect that we'll be seeing some real repercussions to that at sometime soon.
So yeah, kind of going into that, the idea of consequentialism, ethical theories, and like consequentialism suggests that we should act to minimize harm or like save our resources for future generations. Do you think that individuals and governments are morally obligated to reduce these greenhouse gas emissions and temperature increases, even if it comes at a significant cost to our well-being?
That is a good question. If you think about it in terms of like sacrificing our own well-being, I do think that kind of puts you in like a really tough position because you want to make sure to keep the planet safe and healthy for future generations, of course, but doing it at the cost of us is kind of iffy, in my opinion. But that being said, I do believe that there is a moral obligation there to do your best to minimize harm to the environment, to preserve it for future generations.
Yeah, and obviously, like these efforts would be more feasible for like a first world country or a country with a lot of wealth. Do you think that developed countries, being the largest contributors to global warming, they also have a responsibility to adapt to climate impacts, or we should like let them catch up and then like as they become more developed, they learn and appreciate like the earth for what it is, and then they can also combat climate change in their own way.
Um, so a big thing that I've been thinking about recently in relation to that question is the amount of like a carbon footprint, quote unquote,
Hmm.
that a normal average everyday person like you and me put out is minuscule, minute even, compared to the effects of large corporations and large governments bodies doing their work. So I believe that there should be some laws put in place, and that like there should be more regulation for these larger companies and larger bodies that do these kinds of carbon emissions. And in relation to your question, I believe that first world countries, the ones with that house these big companies and these big government bodies, should definitely be playing a bigger role than they are currently and making a greater effort to controlling climate change and looking at the science, looking at the data, and adapting accordingly.
All right. Thank you for your nuanced take on that. I mean, yeah, obviously, going into the fact like whereas like the Amazon rainforest, which is quote unquote called the lungs of the earth, the bee
Hmm.
population decline, and then also the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. I'm sure you've heard of all of these.
Yes, yes.
These are all like very big problems, and the main contributors to like the deforestation and the garbage accumulation are these ma major companies and corporations. So I guess segueing on into that, like we humans tend to value ourselves and like place ourselves higher than like everybody or all the other animals and plant life on this planet. And it's generally a common belief that we all hold. And Do you think that the this often leads to like the exploitation of the environment? And with this perspective, do you think that non-human life should hold equal moral value? Or like, sorry, that's a bad question. Is it like how much value should non-human life hold in comparison with us? Because there is a gradient, obviously.
Mhm. That's a great question. So I believe the term is called homocentrism when you believe that the world revolves around human beings.
Hmm.
And that concept has always been really funny to me because I genuinely look at us and I'm like, yo, we're just animals. We're just like everything else on this planet. We live the same, we breathe the same air, we drink the same water, right? And sure, we live a little bit differently. Of course, we're human beings. But that being said, in terms of like our moral obligation to protect other species and like how do I say this? Like the weight that we exist within. I truly believe that we are just about equal to every other species on the planet. I genuinely believe that every single living thing on this earth has a right, a privilege to be living on this planet. And as human beings, it's up to us to not overextend our reach and overstay our welcome and do things that leave the world a worse place than how we found it.
Yeah, obviously. That's a sentiment that I believe a lot of people share. Obviously every like all life has value, but I wanted to go into something interesting that you talked about where you said we have a responsibility to all the other animals on this planet. Impl I would say that sort of implies that we're not equal to them. This is where I
Mhm.
kind of fall myself. It's like called weak anthropocentrism. And it's essentially where you do believe that humans hold like a little bit more value than the animals, and because of that, like we have a responsibility to them. And I think you brought up a really good point there when you talked about that.
With great power comes great responsibility.
Yeah, of course. So going on like past that, do you think that the Earth has like or nature in general would has intrinsic value, or is the value only dependent on its usefulness to humans?
I believe that nature has its own value. I don't think that basing everything off of how useful it is to human beings is a great way to look at things because just because it's not useful to us doesn't mean it's useful that it's not useful to a lot of other species on the planet, right?
Hmm.
So, like mosquitoes, for example, nobody likes mosquitoes. I hate mosquitoes, you hate mosquitoes, we all hate mosquitoes, but they are an essential part of the ecosystem because their larvae make up a large amount of the food chain for a lot of like smaller water-based organisms. So, like based off of that line of thinking, right? I just don't think that valuing things based on how humans would value them is a great way to look at it. I think if taking a more holistic approach and looking at the ecosystem as a whole is a better way to evaluate such things.
Yeah, of course. So, I mean, going on with that, so obviously that would mean that uh issues like deforestation and pollution, obviously the animals and the plants that are in those environments should influence our approach to it, like situations like that. And that leads me into like one of the biggest contributors to climate change and like environmental pollution, factory farming. It's a major contributor to environmental degradation. And have you ever considered like the ethical implications of like the industrial agriculture on the environment, animals, and human health?
So, I think I come from a particularly interesting background for this question because I went to an agricultural high school here in
Hmm.
Arizona. So, part of my core curriculum was thinking about such things about how agriculture affects the ecosystem, the animals that live within it, the plants that live within it, and how that affects human health as well. Um, while in terms of your question, I would say that there is a certain level of responsibility that we human beings hold in terms of maintaining our own societies, of course. And what factory farming does is it gives us an easy way to make a lot of food for a lot of people very easily.
Hmm.
However, the caveat to that, of course, is that when you do such things, it also like the space that we take up is taking away space from other creatures, right?
Yeah.
So there has to be a sort of balance to it. And ideally, we should find a way to be able to coexist within nature and create enough food for ourselves while also not, getting too free range, just mowing down lots and lots of space and causing a lot of issues within the ecosystem. Um, one piece of history that comes to mind for me when I think about this is the Dust Bowl
Hmm.
in Texas and a lot of the Midwest, of course, when because of the amount of farming that we as a country were doing at the time, we were just plowing land nonstop without a care for making sure that there's enough like true roots in place to keep the ground settled. A storm started and it just kept on going, and it caused a lot of loss of life for a lot of people and a lot of animals, and that
Yeah.
was really really awful. Um, so like that's just like one example that comes to mind immediately when I think about how like human health is impacted by agricultural practices like that.
All right. Yeah, and obviously ties into what we were discussing earlier about corporate responsibility versus our
Mhm.
own individual responsibility in achieving sustainability. And like that really highlights like this concept called enlightened anthropocentrism, which is which I think was founded all the way back when Theodore Roosevelt's presidency, when it's basically just saying that we should be looking out for future generations and farm and could like conduct our business sustainably in nature so that future generations aren't lacking in the resources that we have that are plentiful right now. And so, kind of going into that, there's the whole principle of virtue ethics, which emphasizes like living in a way that demonstrates care and respect for nature, which is, I feel like, is a major thing that these corporate companies are lacking. And like fostering virtues like mindfulness, humility, and environmental stewardship obviously can make a huge difference in that. So, kind of going over to like a future-oriented question, do you think we have an ethical obligation to preserve the environment for future generations? Why do you think so, or why not?
So I genuinely believe that we should definitely be on track to preserve nature as much as we can for future generations. Um, Now, I say that because some things are just irreversible at this point. And so some conservation efforts are going on, but they're not fruitful, right?
Hmm.
I believe like there's species of rhinos that are dying all the time because of poaching and amongst other things, there's a lot of birds that are losing their habitat because of deforestation that we'll never see again, things of that nature. But I believe that doing what we can to make sure that these species that live on this beautiful planet have a place to live and will continue to have a place to live is a big responsibility for us in the present to preserve for the future. And the reason for that is because we are given a gift of life to be able to exist on this planet and be a part of everything that happens on this planet. And I believe that as human beings, as real, moral, and ethical people, we should also be able to preserve that gift to give to our next generation and the generation after that and the generation after that. And the best way to do that is by starting real change that institutional level change that will stay permanent for years and years to come.
All right, Adarsh, thank you so much for sharing your views on these issues and like predominant like problems that we're facing. And thank you for addressing it with clarity. Uh, yeah, it's been a pleasure.
It's been a pleasure, Dinesh.
All right, you have a good one.
You too.